This is a Fox News alert. Let's get up to speed with the very latest developments in the terror attack in New York by a 29-year-old Uzbek national here in the U.S. since 2010. Sayfullo Saipov holds a green card. He was reportedly an Uber driver who was said to be very friendly. But today he pledged his support for ISIS, got in a rented Home Depot truck, and went on a rampage inside of the World Trade Center.
She just said, I saw the man with the guns. He pointed a gun at me. I'm sorry. I have to go get my child.
8 people were killed, at least 11 more injured. The city's mayor calling it a particularly cowardly act of terror. Shepard Smith joins us now live from the scene. Shep, what is the latest about this investigation?
The latest on the investigation is this. Authorities here on scene, not far from the World Trade Center, now tell Fox News, confirming earlier reports, that they found 2 notes indicating that he had expressed loyalty to ISIS. One of those notes inside the vehicle, another just outside it, I believe next to a black bag which fell out of that vehicle. Further, Fox News has learned that in that bag and laying on the street was a knife inside a leather sheath which had a belt clip next to it. They don't know why he didn't use it. The path of the carnage was about a mile long, all down that bike path along Manhattan's West Side Highway, just along the Hudson River. At the end of that mile, he ended up near Stuyvesant High School, a fairly famous school in this area where kids had just let out for the day. 4 of the victims said to have been from that school, 2 staff, 2 students. All of them survived. One of the students still in critical condition at Bellevue Hospital, where some of the survivors are tonight. You mentioned he's an Uzbek national. He had lived in Florida. He had lived in nearby Passaic, New Jersey. At this hour, authorities have surrounded an apartment where he is said to have lived with his wife and 2 children. In addition, they've surrounded a Home Depot store in nearby Passaic, New Jersey. He lived in Patterson. The Home Depot store in Passaic, New Jersey. Robot out, were waiting to enter that vehicle until they were sure that the area was not booby-trapped. As for the victims, 5 of the dead are from Argentina, tourists into New York City, here celebrating a 30-year anniversary from a trade school. Another said to be from Belgium. The other 2 who died in this carnage we don't know about, but authorities say they expect to give more information in the morning. As for accomplices, authorities say, and they don't give us a reason, but they believe he acted alone, was a bit of a lone wolf. If he had training by ISIS, they don't know about it or haven't reported it to us. Was he radicalized online? We don't yet know, but we do know of those 2 notes on scene. In addition, authorities say that they're working with the FBI. The Joint Terrorism Task Force is leading this. The annual Halloween Day Parade went on in nearby Greenwich Village. The mayor and the governor there saying that life must go on in New York, but heightened security at tourist attractions and other areas that tourists visit in the New York City area. And they say that heightened security, Shannon, will remain in place for quite some time.
All right, Shepard Smith covering the story hours now upon end for us. Thank you, Shep. Well, the White House said that President Trump would not appear publicly today, but he did respond on social media. Our chief national correspondent, Ed Henry, joins us with reaction from the Trump administration. Good evening, Ed.
Shannon, good to see you. In fact, the president has put out a series of statements tonight on Twitter and a written statement making clear that the full force of the federal government, the FBI, other law enforcement agencies are now backing the NYPD to get to the bottom of all of this. And we've just learned tonight that the White House Chief of Staff John Kelly wrapped up a dinner on Capitol Hill a short time ago with Speaker Paul Ryan, as well as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and Defense Secretary James Mattis. Now, you would expect that was previously scheduled, talking about all kinds of threats around the world like North Korea, but this must have been a key topic as well, because the White House has been telling us that John Kelly, the chief of staff, has been briefing the president since this afternoon, updating him on the situation on the ground in New York. The president, in that written statement I mentioned, making clear, quote, our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of today's terrorist attack in New York City and their families. My administration will provide its full support to the New York City Police Department, including through a joint investigation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We offer our thanks to the first responders who stopped the suspect and rendered immediate aid to the victims of this cowardly attack. The president ending it by saying these brave men and women embody the true American spirit of resilience and courage. I will continue to follow developments closely. Meanwhile, his opponent in the last election, Hillary Clinton, weighing in on Twitter, as she often does as well. Obviously served as senator from New York and said New York's resilience is stronger than a cowardly act of terror. Thinking of the victims, their families, and the responders who saved lives. I noted the president was on Twitter earlier, so was the First Lady, offering her thoughts and prayers. She is actually in New York City right now, headed back to the White House on Wednesday. But the president went back on Twitter and said something else interesting a short time ago. Quote, I have just ordered Homeland Security to step up our already extreme vetting program. Being politically correct is fine, but not for this. Now, I checked the list of about a dozen countries included on the president's original list of countries with refugees coming in facing extreme vetting here in this country. Uzbekistan not on that list. So you can bet there will be a robust debate in the days ahead, Shannon, about whether even more countries need to be added to that list.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that with a guest coming up. And Henry, thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Appreciate it. All right, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio and New York Governor Andrew Cuomo assuring the public that the suspect acted alone and that public events like tonight's Halloween parade in New York would go on as planned.
We've lived with this before. We felt the pain before. We feel the pain today. But we go forward together, and we go forward stronger than ever. We're not going to let them win.
When asked if the suspect shouted Allahu Akbar or God is great in Arabic, as was reported and some witnesses said, New York officials would only say that he made a statement before getting out of the van and beginning his killing spree. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who serves on the Armed Services Committee, joins us now live. Welcome, Senator. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.
And listen, Ed Henry reported there that the White House said the president's not going to come out tonight and make any kind of statement, but you've talked with him tonight.
Yeah, I talked to him before we came over. The one thing I like about President Trump, he understands that we're in a religious war. And to the American people, we're fighting people who are compelled by their religious views to kill us all. They kill fellow Muslims who don't agree with their view of Islam. They kill Christians and vegetarians, libertarians, Jews, you name it. So we're in a war. And for the last 8 years, the Obama administration turned the war into a crime. So I talked to the president tonight. He is right to make sure that when somebody comes into our country from a place where radical Islam, and that's the enemy, thrives, that we're going to ask extra hard questions. He's also right to look at this as a war. The last thing I want this guy to hear tonight is you have a right to a lawyer. The last thing he should hear is his Miranda rights. I've been a military lawyer for 33 years. There's enough evidence to believe that he qualifies as an enemy combatant under the law of war. He can be held by our intelligence community as long as necessary to find out, did he act alone and was he part of a bigger plot? So I hope President Trump will break the cycle of turning the war into a crime by declaring this guy a suspected enemy combatant, hold him under the law of war until we know exactly who he is and what he did.
You know that when you use the words religious war, that we're at a religious war, that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. And they say that it captures people who are not, you know, of malintent or people who are not radical. But when you frame it in those terms, instead of just saying this is a war among ideologies, when you use the word religion, you know it makes people uncomfortable.
If you ask fellow Muslims, they hate these guys more than we do. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan 43 times. I've never had anybody over there tell me, quit saying radical Islam. They want everybody to know that, one, Islam is not represented by these guys. It's a form of Islam. It requires them to kill us all. Most Muslims don't buy what they're selling. We need partners in this war. I'm glad that President Trump went to Saudi Arabia and urged the Muslim leaders of the world to stand up against this hate. But we're at war, so if you treat it like a crime, you're going to get the same outcome as you did under the Obama administration. The guy we captured in Libya that we think overran the consulate and killed our ambassador and 3 Americans. I talked to the Attorney General today. If this guy's not an enemy combatant, well, what do you have to do to be an enemy combatant? You take up arms against the United States, you break into the consulate, you kill our ambassador. We're not trying to rob the consulate. So here's what I like about President Trump. The gloves are off. He's telling the military you can go after these guys wherever they go. You can kill them when you find them. You don't have to watch them drive away. Now he's got a chance to tell the American people the homeland is part of the battlefield. I hope that President Trump and his team tonight will tell the American people we're going to hold this man as an enemy combatant under the law of war until we can find out whether or not he really is part of a enemy network here.
You say no Miranda rights. All right, I want to read a tweet that comes from you. It's this: there's a sickness in the world that has to be dealt with, and the civilized world must come together to confront it. America should lead that unity.
Yes.
That could have been today, but this was a tweet from you November 13th, 2015 about the terrible attacks in Paris. So what progress have we made in 2 years? How are things different under this administration than they were under the last?
Under this administration, we've changed the rules of engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan. This president left troops behind in Afghanistan when his military advisors told him to do so. This president's changed the way we fight ISIL. Under the new rules of engagement, if you find these guys on the battlefield, you can kill them. We're going after the enemy. The gloves are off. Everybody in the military appreciates the fact that President Trump is allowing the commanders to make decisions on the battlefield. It's not being run out of the White House. The president understands this is a religious war. We're not at war with Islam. We're at war with a sect in Islam who wants to kill us all, including their fellow Muslims. So he's right to slow down who comes into this country. The second order that he issued, I think, is very lawful. He should fight all the way to the Supreme Court to make sure we have extreme vetting from the countries where radical Islam is a real problem. But we just had an attack today. 8 people died on Halloween for no good reason. This man has got all the indications of having been radicalized. I don't know how deeply he's involved in terrorism, but before we turn him over to the lawyer him up, I want him to spend a lot of time with our intelligence community to find out exactly who he is and what he's up to. Maybe we can prevent the next attack if we get this guy in the right hands.
Well, we've got you here because you're so involved with the Senate investigations on what happened with Russia. I want to ask you about that. The latest developments, the indictments yesterday. The indictments did not show any collusion. It was not about a connection, but it was about key players close to the president who did have some allegedly unlawful behavior, many counts of it. Some people think it's overcharged. We'll see. But there was also this plea deal with another person that the Trump administration describes as a volunteer, somebody who wasn't high level, but who was apparently trying to make overtures and bring the Russians together with President Trump when he was running.
Right. So let's look at Manafort and Gates. There's nothing in this indictment to suggest that while they were working for President Trump, they colluded with the Russians. All the activity is prior to the campaign. And Manafort's lawyer said the president's right. There is no indication of collusion here. And so for Manafort's lawyer to tell the world at large that this is not about Russian collusion, he is telling the world that my client did not collude with the Russians. He's going to defend against the charges, but they're completely unrelated to any activity he had in the Trump campaign about this guy who was a unpaid volunteer. If I were a Russian, he'd be the last guy I'd pick to collude with because he had no influence or no power. So if I'm the Trump team, I'm thinking, number one, that Manafort and Gates' problems are unassociated with being part of the campaign, and that Manafort's lawyer is telling the whole world there is no collusion here. So I'd rest pretty good tonight.
All right. Senator, always good to see you.
Thank you.
You seem like you had a little caffeine tonight before you came in.
This bothers me. For 15 years, I've been trying to tell America that we're at war. You need to fight back. You need to fight back smartly. Obama turned this into a crime. And I'm very hopeful that President Trump's going to change the rules of the game. There's a new sheriff in town. And I hope the enemy understands that under President Trump, there's a new way of doing business. And let it start with this guy in New York.
All right, Senator. Great to see you. Thanks for coming in. All right, some officials are sounding as though terror attacks are practically inevitable. Up next, a former CIA officer explains how we can prevent tragedy, even if it takes a whole lot of commitment and changing our lives. Stick around for that. City carried out with a rented truck continues a pattern of terror groups using vehicles as their main weapon of choice. England, France, and Germany have all seen similar deadly attacks, leaving cities around the world on high alert for more that could come. Trace Gallagher is breaking down the details for us. All right, Trace, good evening. What do we know about this being a hallmark now of al-Qaeda and ISIS?
Well, good evening, Shannon. Yeah, ISIS and al-Qaeda have been telling their sympathizers to use vehicles as weapons for many years. In fact, in 2010, the al-Qaeda magazine Inspire had an article titled "The Ultimate Mowing Machine," urging followers to use trucks to mow down the enemies of Allah. ISIS later recommended using rental trucks and knives, and that guidance was followed many times. In fact, in Barcelona, in August, a terrorist drove a rental van down the crowded Las Ramblas shopping district, killing 13. The attacker then pulled out a knife and fatally stabbed a woman. In June, 3 Islamic terrorists drove a rental van into pedestrians on the London Bridge, then jumped out and began stabbing people in the pubs along the bridge, killing 7. And that was just a few months after a vehicle and knife attack on the Westminster Bridge in central London. that killed 4 people. Shannon.
All right, so these attacks obviously not just confined to Europe now, Trace.
No, because in November of last year, an Ohio State student of Somali descent used his car to plow into a group of students on a sidewalk. He then got out and started stabbing people with a butcher knife. The suspect was killed by police, but not before injuring 11 others. And in the wake of the truck attacks in places like the Christmas market in Berlin, Germany, that killed 12, and the 2016 Bastille Day attack in Nice, France, that killed 86 people, New York police have done extensive outreach to truck rental businesses in the New York area. Listen to this.
After attacks on the German Christmas market, after Nice, we repeated those visits 2 more times, either by making telephonic contact, email, or going back to the same places. So the industry has had a high level of awareness on this matter from the NYPD.
And of course, now the task at hand is to figure out if there were any red flags when the New York attack suspect rented a truck at a Home Depot in Passaic, New Jersey. Shannon.
Much more to come on that. Trace Gallagher live for us tonight. Thank you, Trace. Well, ISIS and al-Qaeda have been telling their sympathizers to use vehicles as weapons for many years. In fact, in 2010, the al-Qaeda magazine Inspire had an article titled "The Ultimate Mowing Machine." Trace told us about that, urging followers specifically to use trucks to mow down what they call the enemies of Allah. ISIS later had something similar, and so what can we do, if anything, to prevent the next tragedy? Let's talk about it with Buck Sexton, a former CIA analyst and former member of the NYPD Intelligence Division. He joins us now from New York to walk us through what happened and what we're able to learn from this. Buck, welcome tonight. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
Okay, so Trace told us about what we heard from Inspire, but you've also pointed out the Islamic State's magazine, Rumiyah, that's online, essentially gave bullet points for exactly what we saw happen today. Tell us about that.
It literally had bullet points in Rumiyah, which is the Islamic State's online magazine. In the November 2016 edition, it walked anyone who wanted to engage in this kind of attack through the specifics of vehicle selection, target selection, surveillance beforehand, understanding the routes, and then some other key additions. And this is direct guidance from the Islamic State to anyone who wants to act in the Islamic State. Carry secondary weapons with you, which today we saw 2 fake weapons, and then, of course, a knife. And then also leave a note at the scene pledging your allegiance to the Islamic State. So it seems very clear that this individual may have at least read this guidance, because you can line them up point by point, piece by piece. And that was the whole purpose of Rumiyah's guidance, was to get individuals who have self-radicalized lone wolf terrorists to be able to conduct a successful mass casualty attack with no training, no connectivity to terrorists, and no skill set or tradecraft whatsoever.
All right, given your background in both the CIA and NYPD, I want to ask you a couple of questions. First of all, about those fake guns, because when authorities were first telling us about it this afternoon, they said they described it as it appeared he got out with a couple of legit guns. Found out later one was paintball, and I think one was a BB gun, as far as we know. Do you think, first question, that this individual was trying to be martyred, because that's often the goal for these folks? And secondly, how big of a win is it for authorities that he's actually alive and there may be some intelligence to be gathered from him?
I do think that this is an individual who, well, there are a couple of reasons that he may have been carrying weapons that clearly weren't actually weapons, other than the knife, which he did not, in fact, use in the attack. He dropped it when he got out of the vehicle. But one is to just increase the impact, the psychological impact of the attack in those initial moments. There were a lot of reports early on that this was actually a mass shooting. So it adds to the chaos and the attention. And terror is violence for the purposes of political theater. So this is somebody who's trying to get a message across, and so carrying weapons would do that in some additional way. And yes, I think there's also the high likelihood that this was essentially what we would call, if it weren't a terrorist action, a suicide by cop, that he was hoping that because he had these weapons, he would be shot down, as he was, but he was shot in the abdomen. I know he has survived. He's out of the hospital. So now we may be able to get a much clearer sense of the motive, although, Shannon, I think the motive is already pretty clear. And because it doesn't look like this individual has any ties, in fact, the Islamic State tends not to claim attacks where individuals are in custody, even if there's somebody who has pledged their fealty openly to ISIS. As a result of that, I'm not sure there's much of an intelligence trove that anyone's going to find from this individual. I am doubtful, though we don't know, that he has any connectivity to radicalized individuals abroad. He probably got involved in this on his own on the internet by downloading propaganda, and we'll find out more in the days ahead.
Yeah, and certainly whether there are others, any kind of cell or any kind of connection to other local actors there in the New York area who may still be a threat. I know that all takes time. I want to play something we heard earlier tonight from Michael McCaul, who's the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, talking about the successes we've had with ISIS, but the new problems it creates. Here's what he said.
But I do think, again, the victories we've had over ISIS in Iraq and Syria have diminished their external operation capabilities out of the region. That's the good news. The bad news is the internet is still radicalizing them and instructing them how to kill people here in the United States.
And that, Bug, goes along with one of the tweets we saw from the president tonight, basically saying we must not let ISIS return or enter our country after defeating them in the Middle East and elsewhere. He said enough. But that's the fact. You run them out of one area, you may take away physical territory from them, but it sounds like we're not taking away a lot of ideological territory from these guys.
No, the jihad continues on, especially for many of the foreign fighters who would have found themselves in Iraq or Syria over the course of the so-called caliphate's existence before the fall of Raqqa. Now those foreign fighters are in places unknown. They may be trying to return home. Some of them have. Others will be looking for the next major stage of jihad. And it's perhaps worth noting that this individual came here from the attack, came here some years ago. We know that he's from Uzbekistan originally. That part of the world was actually responsible for a lot of foreign fighters showing up in Iraq and Syria. I don't believe that Saipov himself was, but these are the kinds of attacks now that those who are trying to be returnees, foreign fighters that want to make their way back home, who have EU passports, who have American passports, they will likely conduct, because the efficacy, I mean, the efficiency of terrorists doing attacks like this versus trying to engage in a complex cell, build high explosives, have a multi-pronged attack with weapons that they may get caught, firearms that they may get caught trying to purchase. There's a much greater likelihood of a mass casualty attack with these vehicle attacks, and that is why we're seeing so many of them.
Yeah, we know the NYPD has a program they talked about today, and going to car rental agencies and places like where this truck came from and trying to say, listen, let's share information with each other. If you find something that's troubling, don't let it come to this. Call us first. So
they've had programs like this in place, Shannon, for example, with precursor materials for explosives.
Right.
Helpful, but just a tripwire, not enough on its own to stop all attacks.
Exactly. All right, Buck Sexton, great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Up next, it is called the SAFE Act, and it's intended to stop immigrants from terror hotspots from entering the U.S. We don't know would it have prevented today's tragedy. We're going to talk about that with Congressman Dave Brat, who sponsored the SAFE Act. He's next. Plus, the feds released more documents on President Trump's embattled former campaign manager. Is there or isn't there a smoking gun? What do some folks want to make out of it? Well, our late night investigative team is pouring through those files. They're going to report on the very latest of what's there and what isn't. Next. This is a Fox News Alert. We're getting new details tonight about the conditions of release for former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort and his business associate Richard Gates, who were both indicted Monday as part of special counsel Robert Mueller's probe of possible Russian interference in the 2016 election. Kristen Fisher has been digging through the documents and has the very latest. Hi, Kristen.
Hey, Shannon. Well, we already knew that the special counsel considered both Manafort and Gates to be a flight risk. What we didn't know was how much of a flight risk. And these documents released just hours ago explain why the special counsel was so worried and why the judge agreed to confiscate their passports and place them under house arrest. Mueller wrote that, quote, the defendants pose a risk of flight based on the serious nature of the charges, their history of deceptive and misleading conduct, the potentially significant sentences the defendants face, the strong evidence of guilt, their significant financial resources, and their foreign connections. The documents describe Manafort as a sophisticated international traveler, someone who has 3 U.S. passports with 3 different numbers. They also describe just how much both of the defendants claim to be worth. According to loan applications and other financial filings, in May of last year, Manafort listed his net worth at $136 million, but just 8 months later, he dropped that figure to $25 million, while Gates listed his net worth at about $30 million. There's also their maximum possible sentences to factor in. According to calculations made by the special counsel's office, Gates is facing up to 12 years and 7 months in prison if convicted, while Manafort is facing up to 15 years and 8 months. Quote, the possibility of prison sentences in these ranges alone establishes a risk of flight as to both defendants. So the special counsel is really making the case here that not only do they have a strong incentive to flee, but that they also have the money and the connections to do it, Shannon.
All right, Kristen Fisher, thank you for digging through those documents for us late this evening. All right, turning now to the terror attack in New York. As we've been reporting, 29-year-old Sayfullo Saipov is in critical condition in a New York hospital tonight after being shot by New York City police officers. Saipov is suspected of killing 8 people and injuring many more when he mowed them down in what appears to be a copycat attack of similar tragedies committed in the name of ISIS around the world. Saipov is a citizen of Uzbekistan, the most populous country in Central Asia, where 88% of the population is Muslim. Saipov came here 7 years ago. We're told he has a green card, and essentially that's lawful permanent residence by non-U.S. citizens. Said to be liked by those who knew him. He was variously a commercial truck driver or an Uber driver or both, depending on reports. And apparently he left a note, at least one, maybe 2, and carried out the attack in the name of ISIS. Our next guest sponsored a bill that would make it more difficult for refugees and others emigrating from other terrorist hotspots to enter the U.S. Virginia Republican Congressman Dave Brat joins us live. Good to see you tonight, sir.
Great to be on. Congratulations, Shannon.
Thank you very much. All right, so let's talk about what you've proposed and what you think Capitol Hill could do. We don't know all the particulars of this young man, but we know apparently he came here legally through the right path and pipeline to get this green card. He's not an offender. He's not breaking laws, at least with respect to immigration.
Right. Yeah, but it's kind of the worst case scenario in terms of rational policy that should be in place. And so Paul Ryan promised us this year we'd have 5 of Chairman Goodlatte's bills passed through for a floor vote, including E-Verify and some chain migration stuff, internal enforcement. And then this particular case, in the past 20 years, there have been 2 million green cards coming from the Middle East alone, right? And so the President Trump and some of us who've been working on immigration forever, he wanted to vet people, especially coming from high-risk countries. So this should clearly fall into that pattern. So 2 million people coming in, and after 9/11, immigrants from the Middle Eastern countries are the fastest growing demographic. So you have your political elites to thank for that. We're not doing our job, right? It's not a question of religion. It's high-risk countries. And so the second piece that the president put in was written very well. And so we need to, I think the president weighed in today forcefully, and we need to stop the war before it comes here. And it's here.
Well, and the president said this in one of his many tweets tonight. He said, "I have just ordered Homeland Security to step up our already extreme vetting program," all caps.
Right.
Being politically correct is fine, but not for this.
Right.
And you worry that that's happened too much on Capitol Hill and has led us to these numbers and these situations where we're not saying everyone coming into the country is bad. You're not saying that, but you're saying there's got to be a vetting process. How can we do that when we're talking about tens of thousands, even more than that every single year? How can we look through their social media, examine their backgrounds, their families, what activities they may have been involved in? I mean, that sounds impossible.
Yeah, well, and you raise it in the right way, right? Where's the burden? Immigration is not a right, right? It's a privilege. We are a country of immigrants. That's not the question. We have 1 million immigrants come in every year legally, like you say. But since 9/11, we're all on a new sense of alert. And so the burden is on the folks who want to come in, right? We have to prove in some of these countries, right, if you go to Somalia, et cetera, they don't have a database, right? So it makes vetting very hard. But the burden is clearly on them, right? We got to get to kind of a more merit-based system where people are job ready. They have a resume. We know who they are. They're safe. They like the United States of America. That's not too much to ask. And we've always been a welcoming country. And so we just have to do our job. And then you would think after this last year, right, immigration, it kind of is separable a little bit from some of this vetting. But it's not too much to ask to do policy that's good for the American people, right? So when you do immigration policy, a lot of, there's some huge crony interests in the city. They want cheap labor.
Well, and you and I were talking earlier about E-Verify, because to a lot of average Americans out there, that sounds like this is the system that would make employers who are hiring people use the system so they can verify Social Security numbers are legit, these people are who they say they are, and they're truly citizens, or they're here legally to work. But there are folks on the other side of the hill, not on the other side of the aisle necessarily, who, these are Republican senators who say they don't want E-Verify to be part of a big immigration package. Why?
Yeah, well, because they only run every 6 years and they're not listening to the American people. So some of us on the House side are a little critical of that. Trump won on that issue. I won somewhat on that issue. The American people overwhelmingly want something done there, right? So folks come across the border. They're all, predominantly from, Mexico, South America, et cetera. They're all Catholic. They're all children of God. There's no question on that. But they, on average, they have a 10th grade education. They'll make $20,000. If you got 2 kids in school, that's $26,000. You're upside down before you even started the conversation, right? So, of course, if you add a worker, it's good for the economy in that sense. The economy grows. But most people care about GDP per capita after you pay your taxes and transfer payments. And the average American, it's not lost on them. They're losing in this setup, and so we got to get it right for them.
And a lot of people think when we watched your race, when you upended then Minority Leader Eric Cantor in the primary GOP primary race, that it was about immigration, that people wanted you to come here and do what you've been trying to do. But even within the GOP, there are disruptions and disagreements about exactly how you get there. I mean, I was joking around with you and Senator Graham earlier before you both came on the show to say, hey, we've got 2 of you here. You're not exactly on the same page about immigration. How do you get there within your own party, never mind across the aisle?
Well, you got to listen to the American people. Even the Democrats in Virginia, we got an interesting horse race going on. Ed Gillespie's catching steam quick at the end here, and I think is going to pull out a win. And some of it hinges on this issue. The Democrats have been doing so much identity politics, race and gender, calling names, just horrific commercials going on in Virginia right now.
Very disturbing commercials.
And I think there's going to be a reaction against that, right? So it's gotten so bad, some of the Democrat operatives say, we got to go more Bernie. We got to just go back to class warfare, right? And they're probably right on that, right? If you get back to economic issues, I'll be a little more nervous. But they're losing on the identity politics, right? And it's the American people want to move beyond that. So 47% of Democrats, I think, listed immigration as one of the most important issues in the last week in the polling. And so with incidents like this, people zoom in, focus on this lottery, right? This guy came in on this refugee lottery system, which lottery, right? It's random. We should be very rational about these policies.
Well, we'll watch and see what progress you make.
We will.
Over there on the Hill.
Right.
Congressman Brat, great to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks. Congrats again, Shannon. It's great.
All right, coming up, New York recently stopped monitoring mosques and has long had a strict gun control policy. Now the city is facing new questions tonight about those policies. In Manhattan, Mayor Bill de Blasio earlier urging New Yorkers and the entire nation to pray for the victims, and he says to stay strong.
Tested before as a city very near the site of today's tragedy, and New Yorkers do not give in the face of these kinds of actions.
Staying strong requires vigilance and the tools needed to prevent those kinds of attacks in the first place. Joining me now with some perspective, Rob O'Neill, former Navy SEAL who killed Osama bin Laden, now Fox News contributor. Rob, good to see you tonight.
Thank you for having me, Shannon. I appreciate it.
I know that you have some concerns about policies that hamstring law enforcement and those within our intelligence community that may keep them from being able to keep a beat on these guys. I mean, there are thousands of cases, according to Homeland Security, all over the country in all 50 states. We have to be right all the time.
Yeah, you have to be right all the time. And even right now with someone like Mayor de Blasio, it should be, if you see something, make sure it's politically correct, not say something. So 8 people are dead here on the west side of New York, and he says we must be vigilant after this attack. I mean, what does be vigilant mean when he tries to, he's to a point where he gives a speech to police, the police turn their backs on him. They don't respect, he doesn't respect the men and women in law enforcement because he refuses to help them. He'd rather be politically correct, he'd hate to be labeled Islamophobic, and he won't give them the tools that they need. The first questions I would have for this guy, it's a good thing that he was wounded and now that he can be interrogated, because now the first thing they can ask him is, where is your mosque? Who's your imam? And where's your computer? Because we need to get into those sort of things. And this is where we really need the help from the vast majority of Muslims who are not radicalized, because we have to find out where the radicalization is coming from. And a lot of it is coming from the pulpit here in the United States, from some radicalized mosques. We need to find out where the hate where it originates, and then we need to put a stop to it.
Well, and this has changed and evolved so much over the last few years, and especially since 9/11. I mean, you no longer have to have a connection to a cell, have a conversation with anyone who is actually attached to ISIS. I mean, you can go online, be disgruntled, be despairing about something in your life, and simply follow instructions from an online magazine and kill 8 people.
That's true. And this comes also, not everyone is being radicalized in their home countries. This comes from lawless states, places like, well, Libya right now, because we decided to just go in there and bomb them without a plan. And then Gaddafi, even though he's a horrible dictator, is gone because we pull out too early from Iraq. And, we just start bombing Syria. ISIS forms, places like in Yemen where we were, and then we pulled out, and then in Somalia. They're going to radicalize there too. And then they will have the people smart enough to come in with the technological expertise and to start to do it online. And it took us long enough to decide to stop the Islamic State, even though ISIS said that's exactly what they were going to do, is form an Islamic State. And we didn't do it until just recently under the Trump presidency.
Yeah, and I know that you're worried that there may be a growing feeling in this country as we're told to go on with life, that we may become just used to terrorism like the Europeans have, being part of life.
That's just too bad. We don't need politicians who will tell us to get used to it. We need politicians that'll tell us they're going to fight it. And we're starting to get there now, but we need to drop the political correctness and realize it doesn't matter which side of the aisle we're on. These madmen want to kill us.
That's true. Regardless of our ideology, we know what theirs is.
Absolutely.
Rob O'Neill, great to see you. Thanks for dropping in.
Great to see you too. Thank you for having me.
All right, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo calling today's events a lone wolf attack. We're going to tell you why one expert says lone wolves don't really exist. That's coming up. Are saying today's attack is the work of a, quote, lone wolf. But my next guest doesn't believe that's actually an accurate term for how this all comes about. Raheem Kassan is a senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute and has quite an incredible personal story that's led you to this place. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so I know that you think this idea of a lone wolf, the concept, we may be off with that. How so?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally a misinterpretation of what goes on when these people are radicalized and they find themselves in the sort of behest of radical Islam. These are people who are led here by something, some way, shape or form, and whether that is by attending a mosque, whether that is by speaking to a local imam, whether that is being referred to a particular interpretation of the Quran or Hadith. These people don't find that themselves traditionally, and we have to start looking at where this person went to the mosque, who this person was affiliated with, who his friends were, what they were asking of him. The lone wolf thing is a cop-out. It's a major cop-out, and it's a cop-out, by the way, which our political establishment uses, which, by the way, in a Europe of 2017, where we've had 43 Islamist-inspired or Islamic radicalism-inspired terror attacks or attempted terror attacks, they use this as kind of a way to say, oh, well, you know, we don't have to have a broader conversation about what's in these texts and what these imams are preaching at these Saudi-funded mosques. Fundamentally, what they're saying is we want to wash our hands of it. We don't want to have to deal with this. But actually, that's the best way. If we look at, do you want to bring the Muslim community on board with this? And do you want to make people feel safe in their communities? That's the best conversation to have.
We talked a little bit about in the commercial break how this is very sensitive, because when you talk to people about going back to the imams, looking at their sermons or what they're preaching or what they're saying, or going into someone's mosque, that's a really volatile idea for a lot of people. They think that it's insulting. I know that you think that there are, in some ways, that people in this country are exploiting our love of the freedom of religion and hiding behind that. So where is that balance between privacy, civil liberties, that kind of thing, and religious freedom?
America is a unique place. You know, Americans often forget this. You're the only country in the world who has established the freedom of speech in a First Amendment, the freedom to defend yourself in the Second Amendment, and therefore we think that you know, the tiniest sliver of asking questions in these directions is an attack on those things. It doesn't need to be the case. You see, Islam is not just a religion. It's also a political philosophy. It's a political ideology, and it doesn't offend to ask these questions. I was raised in a Muslim family, and it doesn't offend me, nor does it offend anybody around me that I grew up with, to ask those questions. Actually, what we're doing by not asking these questions is helping the fundamentalists and the literalists, who, by the way, target people, moderates in the Muslim communities around the Western world, who don't want to abide by Sharia law. What we do is we enable and encourage the fundamentalists if we don't ask those questions. By the way, those questions are relatively easily dealt with. They're dealt with in the way that you say, Islam needs a reformation. It needs a reformation much like Christianity had a reformation. It needs a reformation much like many Jews in the Western world don't necessarily want to subscribe to every single element of the Old Testament. But we haven't done that with Islam. It's like we deal with it with kid gloves. And, you know, this is just the next incident. But this is just another incident that proves that if we are going to deal with this issue, we have to be big, grown up, strong about it.
And have difficult conversations.
Difficult conversations.
Raheem Kassam, thank you for coming on and giving us your perspective. Good to see you. All right, we're going to get to late breaking developments from New York next. Stick around. Here on the East Coast at this hour, here's what we know about the terror attack in New York. It seemed to mimic several tragedies around the world committed in the name of ISIS. It happened around 3 o'clock today when a man driving a rented Home Depot truck plowed through bicyclists and pedestrians in the site of the World Trade Center. According to reports, as he got out of the truck, he was shouting Allahu Akbar, or God is great in Arabic. Nearby was a school and a school bus carrying disabled children. He killed 8 people and injured many more. Tonight, their loved ones stand beside them, praying for their recovery at hospitals across the New York area. The suspect is in the hospital, too, after being shot by New York City police officers. Sayfullo Saipov left his native Uzbekistan 7 years ago, came to the U.S., where he got a green card granting him lawful permanent residence. He then started driving trucks and later an Uber taxi. New York officials were quick to say that New Yorkers are strong. They have weathered such tragedies before. They said the Halloween parade would go on and the city, as always, moves forward. They also would not confirm that Saipov said Allahu Akbar. And while President Trump did not appear publicly tonight, the White House said he wouldn't. He did tweet that political correctness is fine for some things, but not for this. He also said that he ordered Homeland Security to step up its, quote, extreme vetting program. That is the very latest tonight. We will continue this news. And of course, Fox News returns live at 4 a.m. You can catch up with the very latest developments overnight then. That's it for us from Washington. Most watched, most trusted, and most grateful that you spent the evening with us. Good night from D.C. I'm Shannon Bream.